The day had that strange, almost haunting stillness that comes after rain but before the sun decides to return. The clouds hung low and heavy, a pale, muted gray that swallowed the sky. The road Daniel was driving on stretched for miles in either direction, slick with fresh rain, bordered by dense patches of forest and the occasional crumbling fence. He had been heading back from a delivery job, his truck's wipers swiping away the occasional drizzle that still lingered in the air, when he saw them, two small figures darting dangerously close to the passing lane. At first, he squinted, thinking maybe they were scraps of trash caught in the wind, tumbling over the wet asphalt. But then one of them stopped and turned toward his headlights, and his stomach clenched. They weren't pieces of garbage, they were alive. Two tiny puppies, both drenched, both trembling so visibly that even from the cab of his truck he could see the quiver in their frail bodies. They couldn't have been more than a few months old. Instinctively, Daniel slowed down, pulling his truck to the side of the road. The moment his tires crunched against the gravel shoulder, the puppies froze, their wide, round eyes fixed on him. Then, without hesitation, they began to move toward him, not cautiously, not with the wary steps of strays who fear human contact, but with an almost frantic urgency. He stepped out, the cold drizzle immediately settling on his shoulders, and crouched down, holding his hands low so as not to frighten them. The smaller of the two let out a whimper so thin and high-pitched that it pierced through the distant sound of cars rushing by. The other, slightly bigger, stumbled on its tiny legs as it approached, pressing its damp head against Daniel's knee. The contact startled him, but what surprised him even more was how they behaved after that. They didn't seem to be asking for food in the way a hungry stray might, nor were they simply looking for shelter. It was as if they were trying to tell him something, pleading in their own silent, desperate language. The smaller one placed both front paws on his leg, looking up with eyes that held not just fear, but determination. The other nudged his ankle repeatedly, then glanced over its shoulder toward the dense wall of trees beyond the roadside, before looking back at him. Daniel's brows knitted together. "What is it?" he murmured, as if they could answer. He reached down to pick one up, and it immediately curled against his chest, shivering so hard that he could feel the tiny heartbeat pounding against his palm. The second puppy didn't resist when he scooped it up too, and they both pressed against each other in his arms, drawing warmth from the closeness. Their fur was matted with mud and twigs, their paws slick from running on wet ground. He could smell the faint scent of damp earth and something else, something sharp, almost metallic, that he couldn't quite place. He stood there on the roadside for a moment, glancing toward the forest the puppies kept looking at. Something about the way they shifted restlessly in his arms made him uneasy. Most stray dogs he'd seen would be nervous, maybe dart away or act skittish. But these two were locked in on him as if he were their only hope, their tiny bodies practically vibrating with urgency. A car roared past, splashing up water from the road, and Daniel took that as a sign to get them to safety before they were hurt. He opened the passenger door of his truck and gently placed them on the seat, wrapping them in the old fleece blanket he kept behind it for cold mornings. They huddled together instantly, but instead of settling down, they began to whine again, short, urgent cries that made his chest tighten. Then came the scratching. The bigger pup hopped awkwardly toward the door, pressing its tiny nose against the glass and scraping at it with one muddy paw. The smaller one joined in, their combined whimpering growing louder. Both of them had their eyes fixed on the same spot, out the window, across the slick road, straight toward the shadows under the forest canopy. Daniel followed their gaze, narrowing his eyes. The woods looked ordinary enough from here, just a tangle of wet leaves, gnarled branches, and mist curling low over the ground. But the intensity in the puppies' behavior told him there was something else. Something they needed him to see. He hesitated. He didn't know what he might find out there. It could be another animal, maybe even something dangerous. And yet, the pull was undeniable. The way these tiny creatures had run straight to him, the way they were now practically begging for him to go that direction, it wasn't random. He turned off the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the sound of the rain dripping from the trees. As he opened the truck door again, the puppies immediately tried to follow, their little paws scrabbling against the seat. He placed a hand up gently. "Stay," he said softly, as if they might understand. One of them let out a sharp, almost impatient bark, and then they both stared at him with such intensity that his chest felt heavy. Daniel adjusted the hood of his jacket and stepped toward the edge of the forest. He wasn't sure why, but in that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that whatever had brought those puppies to him wasn't just about them. Someone, was waiting in those shadows. And by the look in their eyes, there wasn't much time left. The wet leaves muffled Daniel's footsteps as he moved past the first row of trees, but every sound still seemed to echo in the damp, heavy air. The forest had that hushed, almost suffocating stillness that comes after a storm, broken only by the occasional drip of rainwater from branches above. His boots squished in the soft ground, the mud clinging with each step. Behind him, the faint whimpering of the puppies floated through the rain, urging him onward. He followed the line of their gaze from earlier, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. There was no obvious path here, just uneven terrain littered with fallen branches, moss-covered stones, and low-hanging vines. The air smelled of wet bark, decaying leaves, and something faintly sharp, almost metallic. That same scent he'd caught on the puppies earlier. He couldn't name it, but it set him on edge. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the air felt. A patch of low mist hugged the ground ahead, curling around the base of a rotting wooden structure barely visible through the thicket. At first, Daniel thought it was just an old shed, abandoned long ago and left to crumble under the weight of time and weather. But as he drew closer, he noticed something odd. The boards on one side weren't just sagging, they looked like they had collapsed recently. That was when he heard it, a sound so faint that he almost dismissed it as the wind shifting the branches. But it came again, weak, strained, a muffled whimper. It wasn't the high-pitched cry of a puppy. This was deeper, slower, and filled with exhaustion. Daniel froze for a moment, his heart thudding harder. He pushed through a curtain of vines and reached the structure. The shed was half buried in overgrown weeds, its roof caved in and walls leaning precariously. A cluster of broken boards lay scattered around the base, the edges jagged. And there, in the shadow of the debris, he saw her. It was a dog, an adult, clearly older, her fur matted and filthy, her eyes dull but still alive. She was pinned beneath a heavy plank that must have fallen during the collapse. One of her hind legs was caught at an unnatural angle under the weight, and her breathing was shallow, each exhale accompanied by a faint, pained whimper. For a moment, Daniel could only stare. The scene hit him like a punch to the chest. He didn't need anyone to explain. The puppies had been trying to lead him here. This was their mother. The realization made his pulse spike. She wouldn't last long in this condition. Exposure, injury, and sheer exhaustion were written in every trembling muscle of her body. If the rain returned in full, the cold alone could be enough to finish her. Daniel crouched down, speaking softly, trying to calm both her and himself. "Hey, girl, it's okay. I'm here now." She opened her eyes fully at the sound of his voice. They were warm, deep brown eyes, but dulled by pain and fatigue. She didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth, just stared at him for a long second before blinking slowly, as though she recognized something in him worth trusting. He ran his hands over the board, testing its weight. It was heavier than it looked, waterlogged and warped from years of rot. He glanced at the forest floor, searching for leverage, anything he could use to shift it without crushing her further. A thick branch lay a few feet away, its bark stripped in places. He grabbed it and wedged it under the plank, pushing down with all his weight. The wood groaned, the pressure shifting slightly. The dog whimpered again, but stayed still, watching him intently as if she knew this was her only chance. Sweat mingled with the dampness on his forehead despite the cool air. His boots slipped in the mud, his arms straining as he forced the board higher. Finally, with a low, cracking sound, the plank shifted enough for him to pull it away. It fell to the side with a heavy thud, sending up a spray of wet dirt. Freed from the weight, the dog tried to move, but her injured leg buckled, and she collapsed again. Daniel was beside her in an instant, sliding the blanket he had brought from the truck under her fragile body. Up close, he could see just how bad her condition was. Her ribs showed under her muddy fur, her paws were raw, and there were small cuts along her side, likely from crawling in desperation. "You've been fighting too long," he murmured, lifting her gently. She was lighter than he expected, a ghost of the strong dog she must have once been. As he began the slow walk back through the forest, the puppies appeared ahead, bounding toward them despite their exhaustion. They yipped softly, their tails wagging in relief as they circled his legs. The mother's eyes followed them, and for the first time, Daniel thought he saw the faintest spark of life return to her gaze. It struck him how extraordinary it was. Those tiny pups had braved the road, approached a complete stranger, and somehow convinced him to follow them. They hadn't been looking for food or shelter. They had been on a rescue mission. Back at the truck, Daniel laid the mother dog on the seat, tucking the blanket around her before placing the puppies beside her. They immediately pressed themselves against her sides, licking her face, crawling over her as if to reassure her she wasn't alone anymore. The mother exhaled a slow, shaky breath and closed her eyes, her head resting against her babies. Daniel sat for a moment, watching them. The world outside was still gray and wet, but inside that cab, there was something else, something almost sacred. 3 lives that had been holding on by the thinnest of threads were now together, safe for the moment. He started the truck, determined to get them to the nearest vet as quickly as possible. As the tires rolled onto the slick highway, he couldn't shake the thought, if he had driven by just a minute earlier. Or later, if he hadn't noticed the pups, if he'd ignored their desperate plea, she would still be lying there, alone in the cold, waiting for help that never came. But fate, or maybe something greater, had made sure their paths crossed. And now, it was his turn to make sure that second chance counted. The drive to the vet was quiet except for the soft, rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional whimper from the mother dog. The puppies, exhausted from the ordeal, huddled tightly against her, their tiny bodies forming a warm cocoon of love and reassurance. Daniel kept glancing over, his hands tight on the wheel, afraid that if he took his eyes off them for too long, something might happen. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but there was something about this moment, the fragility of those 3 lives, that pressed heavily on his chest. By the time he pulled up to the small veterinary clinic on the edge of town, the rain had stopped, though the air still carried that damp chill that seeps into your bones. He scooped the mother dog into his arms, careful of her injured leg, while the puppies scrambled after him, unwilling to let her out of their sight. The receptionist's eyes widened the moment they entered. "Oh my gosh, get drive, Myers," she called toward the back. A moment later, a woman in a white coat appeared, her expression instantly softening as she took in the sight before her. "Let's get them into an exam room," she said briskly, motioning for Daniel to follow. The next hour passed in a blur of gentle voices, soft towels, and careful hands. Dr. Myers examined the mother first, speaking as she worked. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, at least 2 broken ribs, probably from blunt force, maybe a fallen object. She's lucky nothing punctured a lung. And this leg here, dislocated." She glanced up at Daniel with a look that was both serious and grateful. "If you hadn't brought her in today, I don't think she'd have made it through the night." Those words hit Daniel harder than he expected. He thought back to the moment he saw the puppies on the road, how close he'd come to just driving past. His throat tightened. "She's their mom," he said quietly. "They came to find me." The vet nodded, clearly moved, before turning her attention to the puppies. They were underweight, with minor scratches and signs of exhaustion, but otherwise healthy. "They've been taking care of her in their own way, drive," Myers explained, smiling faintly. "Keeping her warm, staying close. You don't see that level of instinct and loyalty in one so young very often." Once the medical care was done and the mother was stabilized with fluids, pain medication, and a splint for her leg, the 3 were placed in a large kennel lined with fresh blankets. The puppies immediately curled up beside their mother, their tiny faces pressed into her fur as if they'd been apart for years instead of just hours. The mother licked each one in turn, her eyes half closed, a soft sigh of contentment escaping her. Daniel stayed longer than he'd intended, sitting in the waiting area while the staff finished paperwork. He kept thinking about how everything had unfolded, the urgency in the puppies' eyes, the trust they'd placed in a stranger, the quiet bravery of the mother holding on for them. It was more than just a rescue. It was a story of survival, of a family that refused to be broken apart no matter the odds. Over the next few weeks, Daniel visited the clinic often. At first, it was just to check on them, but soon it became part of his routine. The puppies would recognize him instantly, tumbling over each other to reach the kennel door whenever he walked in. The mother, still recovering but steadily improving, would lift her head and wag her tail in slow, grateful sweeps. The staff began to joke that the dogs were more excited to see Daniel than anyone else, but they all knew it wasn't just a joke. The bond was obvious, rooted in that day on the roadside and strengthened with each visit. When the time came for them to be discharged from medical care, the shelter workers asked if he knew anyone who might adopt them. Daniel had already made up his mind. He didn't want them split up, didn't want the pups to lose their mother or the mother to lose her babies. "I'll take them," he said without hesitation. All three. The adoption paperwork was signed that day, and by evening, they were riding home in the back of his truck, this time not as frightened, desperate strays, but as a family, together and safe. Life changed quickly after that. Daniel's small house became filled with the sounds of puppy paws skittering across the kitchen floor, playful yips, and the gentle sighs of the mother dog as she watched her pups grow stronger. He named the mother Grace, because that was what had carried her through her ordeal. The puppies became Scout and Willow, names that suited their adventurous spirits and the courage they'd shown. There were challenges, of course. The vet visits for Grace's leg, the chewed-up shoes, the muddy paw prints tracked in from the yard. But every inconvenience was outweighed by the joy they brought. On cold nights, all three would pile onto the couch with Daniel, the puppies curled against his sides while Grace rested her head on his lap. He'd sit there, one hand buried in her fur, and think about how easily they could have been lost to the world. One afternoon, several months later, Daniel brought them back to the clinic for a checkup. The same staff who had first seen them gathered around, marveling at the transformation, Grace's coat now glossy and full, her eyes bright and alert, Scout and Willow bounding around with endless energy. "You'd never guess what they've been through," one of the vet techs said, shaking her head in amazement. Daniel just smiled, watching as Grace leaned gently into his side. "They saved each other," he said quietly. "And I guess they saved me too." The story of the two puppies and their injured mother became something of a local legend in town. People would stop Daniel on walks to ask about them, and he'd tell the story, not to boast, but because it reminded him, and everyone else, of the extraordinary things love and loyalty can do. And every time he looked at them, at Grace's calm, steady gaze, at Scout and Willow's boundless joy, he knew the truth. That day on the rainy roadside hadn't been chance. It had been a rescue, yes, but it had also been a beginning. Because some family bonds aren't formed by blood alone, they're forged in moments of desperation, in the courage to trust a stranger, and in the unshakable will to stay together, no matter what. And once formed, those bonds don't break. Not ever.